The wind across the Helmand River Valley was a living thing, a constant, angry presence that whipped grit into faces and moaned through the crevices of the forward operating base. For the men and women of the 2nd Battalion, it was just another Tuesday. For Sergeant First Class Marcus Thorne, it was a nightmare. He stood on the observation deck of the small patrol base, a pair of high-powered binoculars glued to his eyes, his jaw clenched so tight he thought his teeth might crack. 2 clicks away, just over 4,000 meters, a thin, gray-black plume of smoke rose from a rocky outcrop. That was their target. Intelligence had pinpointed it as a major Taliban command post and weapons cache, a linchpin in the insurgency's supply chain. For 3 weeks they had been planning this strike. For 3 weeks they had been told it would cripple the enemy's operations in the entire province. But now, the plan was in shambles. The original assault team, a 30-man-strong force, had been compromised an hour ago. Their insertion path was spotted by a goat herder who had almost certainly run to the Taliban. Surprise was gone. The outcrop, once a target, was now a fortress. Heavy machine guns were being maneuvered into place. Fighters were scurrying into prepared fighting positions. Sending in ground troops now would be a slaughter. The only option left was the one they had held in reserve, a single, devastating sniper shot. Not to take out a fighter, but to hit something far more valuable. Intelligence suggested the compound's main cache, filled with hundreds of mortar rounds and drums of homemade explosives, was stored in a specific, reinforced cave. A well-placed shot from a .50 caliber round could, in theory, create a spark. A spark in that environment would create a catastrophic, secondary explosion that would level the entire command post. It was a long shot in every sense of the word. "Any joy?" Thorne asked, not lowering his binoculars. The voice that crackled back in his earpiece was strained. "Negative, Sergeant. Wind's shifting too much. First round went high and right. Second was a clean miss. Adjusting for elevation, but that thermals are playing havoc." Thorne watched as a third and then a fourth puff of dust erupted hundreds of meters from the target. The enemy fighters down there probably hadn't even heard the supersonic cracks of the bullets passing overhead. They were just confused by the random impacts. For 10 agonizing minutes he watched the spectacle. Round after round was sent downrange, each one a beautiful, technically perfect shot that was foiled by the chaotic, unpredictable physics of the air between the shooter and the target. The air shimmered with heat, creating mirages that distorted the image of the cave entrance, making it dance and shift like a desert ghost. The wind, which they had measured in gusts of up to 30 miles per hour, was curling over the ridgelines in unpredictable vortices. It was a sniper's worst nightmare. After the 10th shot, a frustrated silence filled the comms. Thorne could feel the hope draining from the command post. He lowered his binoculars and turned to the commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Jameson, who stood beside him, his face a mask of stone. "Sir," Thorne said, his voice low, "the conditions are too degraded. The wind is a mess. The heat mirage is making the target look like it's underwater. He's the best we have, but this is outside the effective range for a guaranteed hit, even for him." Jameson didn't move. He just stared at the distant smoke plume. The responsibility for the lives of his men weighed on him. The failure of the mission weighed on him. He needed a miracle, and miracles weren't part of a soldier's standard kit. He turned from the railing, his voice cutting through the tense air of the command post. It wasn't a shout, but it carried to every corner. "Do we have a sniper?" The question was met with a profound silence. The men at the comm stations looked at each other. The intelligence officer shuffled his papers. Of course they had snipers. They had just watched one of their best fail for 10 straight shots. The question wasn't about availability, it was about capability. It was a desperate plea for an option no one had thought of. Then, a quiet voice spoke from a corner of the room where a woman was hunched over a laptop, running ballistic calculations. Specialist Lena Kuzmin had been part of the battalion for 18 months. She was a slight woman, with keen, unblinking eyes and hands that were surprisingly steady. She was a surveyor and cartographer by trade, attached to the battalion to create detailed terrain maps. But her real passion, and her hidden talent, was long-range marksmanship. On the base's small, informal range, she was a legend. She could consistently hit targets at distances that made the seasoned infantrymen shake their heads in disbelief. She never bragged, never competed for attention. She just shot. It was a quiet, meditative practice for her. Thorne knew about her skill. He'd seen her on the range one afternoon, methodically drilling a quarter-sized group at 1,000 yards with a standard-issue M24. He had asked her about it, and she had simply shrugged and said, "It's just math, Sergeant. Wind speed, Coriolis effect, spin drift. You do the sums, and the bullet goes where the numbers say it will." Now, in the tense silence following Jameson's question, Thorne remembered that afternoon. He looked at Lena. She wasn't looking at her laptop anymore. She was staring at the distant smoke plume through the open door of the command post. Her eyes narrowed, her head tilted slightly as if she was feeling the wind on her skin. "Sir," Thorne said, his voice hesitant, "there's Specialist Kuzmin." Every head in the room swiveled to look at Lena. Jameson's gaze followed theirs. He saw a slight, unassuming woman, not a grizzled combat vet. "The cartographer?" he asked, the skepticism heavy in his voice. "She can shoot, sir," Thorne said, more firmly now. "Better than anyone I've seen." Lena stood up slowly. She didn't look at the colonel. Her eyes were still on the distant target. "The wind at that range is cycling," she said, her voice soft but clear. "It's not a constant speed. It's a pattern. The mirage is a problem, but it's consistent. The shooter was trying to fight it. You don't fight it, you use it." The room was silent. She had just critiqued the work of a highly trained special operations sniper with a calm, analytical detachment that was almost unnerving. Jameson stared at her for a long moment. He saw no arrogance in her, only a deep, unsettling certainty. He was out of time and out of options. He gave a short, sharp nod. "Get her on the gun." Minutes later, Lena was lying prone on the dusty rooftop of the command post, her body pressed into the unforgiving gravel. In front of her was the massive .50 caliber rifle, its long barrel extending out over the parapet. It felt cold and alien in her hands, a piece of heavy machinery compared to the familiar bolt actions she was used to. But the principles were the same. It was just math. She didn't look through the scope right away. Instead, she placed a wetted finger in the air, feeling the direction and temperature. She watched the dust devils spiraling in the no-man's land between her and the target. She studied the way the heat haze made the distant rocks shimmer, noting the patterns, the rhythm of its distortion. For 5 full minutes, she just observed. The soldier next to her, the spotter who had just missed 10 shots, watched her with a mixture of awe and humiliation. She wasn't even looking at the rifle. Finally, she leaned into the scope. The crosshairs settled on the dark maw of the cave entrance, 4,000 meters away. It was an impossible distance. The bullet would be in the air for nearly 6 seconds. In that time, the Earth would rotate beneath it, shifting its path. The air density, the temperature, the humidity, the gravitational pull of the planet, all of it had to be calculated and compensated for. Lena began to whisper to herself, a stream of numbers and observations. Target wind at 2 o'clock, full value. Mirage is boiling, indicates a 5 to 7 miles per hour wind at the target. Thermal gradient is steep. Coriolis effect will push the round .4 MOA to the right. Spin drift, another .3 MOA. Her spotter scrambled to keep up, entering her observations into a handheld ballistic computer, cross-referencing them with atmospheric data. "Solution is 247 clicks up, 11 right," he whispered, his voice trembling. Lena didn't acknowledge him. She was in her own world, a world of pure physics. She adjusted the scope's turrets, the clicks sounding loud in the tense silence. She took a deep, slow breath, letting half of it out. The crosshairs wavered for a moment over the cave, then settled into a steady, almost imperceptible hold. She wasn't aiming at the cave. She was aiming at a point in space, 6 seconds in the future, where the bullet and the cave would meet. The wind gusted. She saw the mirage ripple, and in that split second of change, she saw her moment. Her finger, resting lightly on the trigger, squeezed with a slow, constant pressure. The crack of the rifle was deafening, a physical blow that echoed across the valley. The massive rifle bucked against her shoulder. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, a plume of dust erupted not on the cave, but on the rock face a good 10 meters to its left. A miss. A collective sigh of disappointment seemed to gust through the command post. But Lena didn't move. She didn't flinch. Her eye was still glued to the scope, watching the impact site. The dust from her miss was hanging in the air, a tiny brown cloud. She watched how the wind caught it, how it swirled and dissipated. She watched how the heat haze interacted with it. Her spotter started to speak. "Adjusting left." "No," Lena said, her voice firm. "Don't adjust." She had just fired a ranging shot. A miss, but a perfect ranging shot. She now had a visible marker of the wind at the target. She could see the exact speed and direction based on how the dust from her shot behaved. The numbers in her head recalibrated in an instant. She reloaded the massive bolt action. This time, she didn't hesitate. She found the cave entrance again. She visualized the arc of the bullet, a high, looping parabola that would climb thousands of feet into the air before arcing back down onto the target at a devastating angle. She compensated for everything. The wind, the spin, the rotation of the earth, the tiny atmospheric changes revealed by her first shot. She breathed. The crosshairs settled. The world fell away. There was no war, no Taliban, no lieutenant colonel watching her with bated breath. There was only the target, the bullet, and the 6 seconds of flight time that separated them. She squeezed the trigger. The crack was the same. The recoil was the same. But this time, as she fought to get the scope back on target, she saw it. A tiny, brilliant flash of light from deep within the cave. It was instantaneous, a pinprick of brightness in the dark maw. Then, the world ended. The entire top of the rocky outcrop seemed to lift into the air. A massive, billowing orange fireball erupted from the cave, consuming the entrance and everyone near it. The secondary explosion was catastrophic, a chain reaction of detonating munitions that tore the command post apart. The shockwave, a visible ring of distorted air, raced across the valley, and a few seconds later, a thunderous boom rolled over the patrol base, shaking the very ground they stood on. On the rooftop, the silence was absolute. Lena stared through the scope at the inferno where the cave had been, her face pale, her breathing shallow. The spotter next to her had stopped breathing altogether. In the command post below, a stunned silence was broken by a single whispered exclamation from Lieutenant Colonel Jameson. "My God." The impossible shot had been made, a 4,000-meter kill shot, not on a man, but on a fortress. The modest cartographer, the woman who was never supposed to be on the gun, had done what 10 shots from a seasoned professional could not. Sergeant First Class Thorne was the first to reach her on the rooftop. He saw her slowly sit up, pushing a stray strand of hair from her face. She looked at the burning mountain in the distance, then down at the massive rifle in front of her. There was no triumphant smile, no fist pump. She just looked at the weapon as if it were a particularly complex piece of surveying equipment that had just performed an unexpected function. "Good math," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. Then she looked up at Thorne, her expression as calm and analytical as ever. "The wind data was cleaner on the second shot." She stood up, dusted the grit from her uniform, and walked back towards the command post, leaving the stunned soldiers and the smoking ruin of an enemy stronghold in her wake. She had not sought the moment. The moment had sought her, and when it did, she had answered not with bravado, but with quiet, undeniable certainty, proving that in the chaos of war, sometimes the most devastating weapon is a mind that sees the world not as a battlefield, but as a problem to be solved.